Hey everybody, welcome to episode 64 of the AskDAP show, where we answer your Volkswagen Audi questions. On this episode, we talk about gas mileage on tuned cars and springs on Mark 7s with DCC suspension.
Scott via shopdap.com says, how is gas mileage MPG affected when tuning my 2016 GTI?
Gas mileage on tuned cars is actually something that gets asked about pretty frequently, people who are considering tuning cars. When it comes to VW and Audis, most cars that are tunable in the way that you would want them to be tunable, as in the significant investment of software is worth it for your vehicle, it's going to be on turbo cars. The best part about turbo cars, and this is the main reason why a lot of manufacturers are going that way, is because turbo cars are kind of the best of both worlds when it comes to performance and fuel economy. So when you tune a car that has a turbo on it, basically a lot of the gain in power is related to the turbo. So when you're not driving it like you stole it, your fuel mileage difference is not going to be very much. So that's the big benefit. There's actually a lot of things that we've heard in regards to gaining slight fuel mileage on cars. You know, that's something that, it's not the purpose of why you should ever modify a car with software, but it could be an added bonus that you might gain, you know, a little bit on the highway for fuel economy. But, you know, if you drove your car like you stole it everywhere you go, you're definitely going to lose gas mileage. That's true whether your car is completely stock or tuned. It just tuned happens to make it worse, because sometimes you tend to be into the pedal a little more often because you want to enjoy, obviously, the additional power you have. So hopefully that answered your question and can help you make the decision for tuning your car. But know that driving style has a lot more to do with it than the actual software itself.
Got a Mark 5 GTI with the AXX engine. Got a code for misfires in cylinder 3. I swapped the coil, swapped plugs, misfire stays in cylinder 3. I checked the compression on all 4 cylinders, compression's good and even. Put all 4 new coils and plugs, and I'm still having the misfire on 3. Should I move it onto the injectors next? Is there any way to physically test the injector? No fault codes at all for the fuel injectors.
So this engine code he's referring to, I think it's AXX, is actually a European engine code, but because it's an FSI or even any TSI would still apply to a lot of this information, this would generally be applicable to anybody with any 2-liter turbo engine or really any direct injection engine. It sounds like you've gone down the right steps of coils, plugs, for diagnosing your misfire. Again, hopefully you've done a few things to try to make sure that there's nothing else. It sounds like you've done a compression test, which also sounds like you already have eliminated mechanical problems as an issue related to your stuff. I would make sure that you've cleaned the cylinders because direct injection, that there's no carbon buildup. But more than likely, your issue is going to be fuel injector related. That definitely is the next most logical step in this situation. You have a couple options when it comes to this. You can just buy an injector for that vehicle. I don't know, they're $100-ish, $110. I'll put a link to them here where you can check it out. But more importantly, in these situations, you have a couple different scenarios. You can test it, which means you can pull off the intake manifold, swap the injectors from, let's say, 2 to 3, and then see if the misfire moves, and that will help you identify if you have a fuel injector problem. The issue with that is obviously the amount of work it takes to get to a fuel injector may not be worth all that work to do another time just to identify you've got a bad fuel injector, especially when you're talking about fairly minimal cost, and even more so if you're paying somebody to do it. If you're paying somebody to swap those injectors, there's no chance it's going to make sense, because then you're going to pay them to do the job twice. So in that circumstance, what most places are going to do is, instead of properly diagnosing it, which would be to swap injectors to verify, they're just going to say, hey, we should replace that fuel injector, because obviously when you start weighing out cost benefit, it just makes sense to just buy a new injector, put it in, and then go down that road identifying if that solves your problem, which my guess is it's probably very likely it will, you know, and so hopefully that at least helps you go down the road of making the best choice.
Andreas via shopdap.com says, looking at lowering springs for my GTI 6-speed manual performance pack with DCC, and I'm getting lots of conflicting info regarding bouncy rod and VWR springs. iBox supposedly works great, but they only have progressive versions in the US, which is also bad ride on the DCC. Thoughts? I'm hearing success with driver gear springs and Audi TT plates in the rear. I would love to get a 1 to 1.5 inch drop and get rid of the rake look on the car, but not compromise the ride.
Andres, so for anybody who's not familiar with what he's referring to, DCC is dynamic chassis control. It is the adjustable suspension that comes on Mark 7s. It would be a button in the vehicle. It's electronic dampening. So what we've heard in regards to this is the springs are all applicable to DCC stuff. It just depends on what application you look at as to whether they say they're listed for it. And you know, there's a lot of conflicting information that I think that people see, because a lot of this is really subjective. Because when it comes to Golf R owners, there's a wide variety of type of people who are Golf R owners. Some of them are, you know, very performance enthusiasts that range all the way from people who are really meticulous about their cars and just like to modify them, tweak them a little bit. But those people, some of those people on that end of the spectrum who are really meticulous, aren't really willing to make any sacrifices. And the reality is, anytime you modify a car in any way, there's going to be sacrifices that you make. You know, for example, dog bone mounts are something that reduces the amount of engine rock during acceleration and deceleration. It will give you less wheel hop. It will give you better traction, and overall feel relating to launching is going to be better. But because you're now stiffening up something that is directly attached from the engine to the car, you're going to get slightly more vibration that comes through that into the vehicle. So that's one compromise, you know. And I've seen people make comments about those that say, I wish they came from this like the factory, or they should have come from this in the factory, and then people who say, I hate it and I'm taking it out of my car. And that kind of goes along the same lines with springs on DCC cars. DCCs seem to be a little bit more so just because of the dampening variables. So we had the guy who we did the Mark 7 Golf R install on is a friend of ours who has a DCC Golf R. And basically the way he described it to me was that he has VWR springs, by the way, which, by the way, they are not linear. You mentioned that everybody has progressive rate springs. I'm not aware of any actual real linear springs out there. I think there's a lot of confusion about this stuff out there. I'm not aware of a linear spring out there for Mark 7s. VWR has something that they call a hybrid spring, where part of it's progressive rate, part of it's linear. But essentially it is a progressive rate spring. It's just a little bit different than the normal progressive rate spring. But basically what that guy said to me was that everything was slightly just a bump stiffer. So your standard comfort ride was slightly stiffer than it was before, and then it all goes down the line from there. So you still get the adjustability, it just kind of shifted from my understanding of it. And I think that's the best explanation you're gonna find, is that because when you get somebody who says, oh, I have iBox and I like them, their perspective may be different than the person who bought VWRs and said they hate them. And same goes for H&R or any other brand, is that the person who bought that specific spring is going to have a different perspective. Now, again, getting a general consensus from the community is probably a good idea. In regards to the driver gear springs, I don't know. Driver gear springs are tough because VW never intended driver gear springs to be for any of these cars. It was something that driver gear springs on Mark 7s are only applied for the Golf only. So people put them in other cars like the GTI and other cars, and they fit fine, but they were never intended to operate there. So a lot of people go into that thinking that driver gear springs are a correct application, and they're not. So it's just something to be aware of when you're going down that road. So hopefully that answers your question. Again, I think this subject is very personal and subjective, and every answer is going to be different. But hopefully I've armed you with at least some of the information to make the decision for yourself.
SDMTB via YouTube says, do I necessarily need a special tool to install the new O-ring kits on the injectors? Same question for installing the injectors back into the head.
Okay, so do you need the special tool for the fuel injectors when installing injector seals? The basic answer to the question is yes, you do. So for anybody who's not familiar, whenever you're taking out an intake manifold on any direct injection car on VW and Audis, or really just, it probably is going to be varied depending on engine, but 2-liter turbos, TSI and FSI, both, when you remove the intake manifold, there's a very likely chance the injectors are going to come out with the intake manifold. On TSIs, sometimes, because a lot of people take them off for carbon cleaning, sometimes they come out, sometimes they don't. But whenever you do take them out, you do want to replace the injector seals, and there are repair kits for the injectors for replacing it. So what happens is there's actually a special tool for installing the tip seal. There's a small Teflon O-ring at the tip of the injector where it goes into the cylinder head, where you're supposed to replace that seal. Basically, the idea of the tool is to ramp up slowly to prevent too far expansion of that seal, because it's a Teflon O-ring, to get it over the, basically you got to get it over there and then snapped into the channel it belongs into on the injector. I'm not aware, and maybe people can comment below if I've ever tried this and had success without the tool. I've heard people mention that they've tried and failed and had an injector leak after that. The biggest concern I always have is because direct injection cars, obviously the fuel injector is directly in the cylinder, that injector itself is under a tremendous amount of pressure. So whenever you put that much pressure going in there, if you mess with that seal in any way, that could potentially cause issues. Who knows down the road, maybe you have a weird misfire because it's allowing too much cylinder pressure out through the injector, or some other weird situation like that, and you have this misfire that you're chasing forever that you can never find, just because you didn't replace that seal properly or didn't replace it at all. That's a possibility. You know, you can always roll the dice and not replace it, and hopefully nothing happens. Maybe that's something that people do all the time and I'm not aware. But I have heard that people who have tried to replace it without that tool can potentially just get it spread a little bit too far to where it doesn't function properly afterwards. I don't know. You know, again, we're not a shop who does repairs like that, so I can't say specifically that yes or no to that question because I've tested it firsthand myself. I just know based on my experience and what is kind of out there in the community and within people I know. So that's kind of the gist of that. The alternative is, and this is something that I've recommended to people who have either bought the parts for a job like this or bought injector seal kits and they don't want to buy the tool because it is an expensive tool. I'll link to the tool so you can check it out, or if you're in need of it. My recommendation in that circumstance is going to be to go to a dealer and pay them to install the tip seals for you. So while there will be some cost associated with that, you won't have to buy a tool that's expensive to actually use and then now have a tool that you can't return. So that's kind of the idea of that, and maybe they charge you, I don't know, $30 or $50 to allow them to give, you can just bring them the injectors with the seals and say, hey, can you just replace these? Again, contact your local dealer. I'm sure they can probably help you, or maybe any VW or Audi specialist shop might have a tool like that on hand that they would be able to do it for you too. Again, you know, a half-hour labor seems like it would be more than enough that most dealers would be willing to do that for you. So at a charge of, let's say, $50, it's definitely worth it for you to just have that done as opposed to having to buy a tool for that job. Again, failing to replace it could potentially be some headaches down the road. If you're willing to take the risk, that's obviously up to you to make the decision whether you feel like that's the right choice for you to take the risk. But my recommendation for anybody is always going to be to replace the parts that VW or Audi recommends that you should replace.
Philip Stroh via shopdap.com is getting the following fault codes. He went to the dealer and performed an oil change with new spark plugs, new coils, and a decarb, costing $1,300. Once this was done, the car mileage did increase and the check engine light went off, but when at idle under the pedal, once in a while I still feel the car engine misfiring as it goes up and down, exactly the same way as it was doing previously. Could it be something else, or maybe they didn't do a good job cleaning the carbon?
All right, so you had a slew of faults, looks like some misfire codes, and then one of them is kind of a generic code. It sounds like something about idle issue. This situation is going to be a little bit challenging just because obviously we don't know if you have current faults or maybe they haven't been tripped yet to come back. And that's a possibility, is maybe the faults haven't been tripped to come back yet, and that's why there's no check engine light yet. Maybe it will come soon. A couple things my concern. Obviously, new plugs and coils is great. Obviously, when it comes down the road of misfiring, that is important. I did a video talking about how to diagnose misfires on cars, which I'll link to here. It sounds like you're not 100% certain that it's still misfiring. It sounds like you actually know that it's has a rough idle and is not running perfect, which could be a slew of things. You could have a vacuum leak, which could be causing that, and that's what maybe that P0301 fault, something about idle control, something. So maybe you had a vacuum leak originally, which was causing it to be a problem, or maybe you have a bad throttle body, which is, you know, related to a lot of that stuff, and that's why you still have a bad throttle body before. Any of these situations, what I always recommend under these circumstances is go back to the dealer, let them know what's going on. Whoever performed the work, most likely they shouldn't be charging you to bring your vehicle back in to verify that the work they did was correct. I wouldn't make the assumption they would say, okay, let's take a look at what's going on. If you brought it in for X problem, it's still having X problem, you should then obviously have them take care of that and look at it to identify what's going on. Now, it gets dicey if they tell you new parts have failed. That's when things get really questionable, because it's hard to say definitively, yes, they're wrong, or no, they're not wrong, or whatever. Because a lot of times, you know, in my own experience, I've seen cars literally pulling out of the shop for one completely separate issue, have a check engine light come on for a new issue. Most people who have been in the repair business for any significant amount of time would have seen that. It's unfortunate, and because people have a lot of questions about the people who are working on their vehicles to begin with, when something like that happens, obviously automatically leads you to believe that you're being deceived. And I understand why people feel that way. It's obviously sometimes it's true and sometimes it isn't. There's people who are great and some people who are terrible. So going down the road of trying to at least identify what's going on first and then go from there is my advice. Again, if you're doing the work on your own or trying to diagnose on your own, go through, try to identify if you actually have misfires. That video talks about a live misfire counter with an OBD11 that gives you the ability to see cylinders and live data to identify if something actually is misfiring or not. That will obviously lead you down the road of checking what's going on specifically. So hopefully that answers your question. And again, I feel for your situation, and hopefully you can get it resolved. Thank you so much for watching episode 64 of the AskDAP show, where we answer your Volkswagen and Audi questions. If you have any questions or comments about the questions answered in this show, be sure to leave the comments below. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more like it.